Hey everyone, Benoy here, and I wanted to share a few quick updates with the Solar Maverick community before we get into today's episode. First, we're hosting a summer solstice fundraiser on June 4th in Jersey City, New Jersey to support Let's Share the Sun, an incredible nonprofit bringing solar to underserved communities in Puerto Rico. This will actually be my third delegation in the past year, and one of the most impactful parts of the experience is meeting the beneficiaries and hearing firsthand how solar is transforming their lives. It's going to be a great evening with strong networking and a chance to support a real meaningful mission. If you're interested in sponsoring, feel free to message me. On April 28th, I will be at the Mid-Atlantic Solar and Storage Industry Association MCA Insight Conference in New Brunswick, New Jersey. I'll also be doing a live Solar Maverick podcast interview with some of the greatest minds in AI, talking about how AI is going to impact the renewable energy industry. So definitely come check that out. And on May 14th, I'll be speaking at the American Council of Renewable Energy Finance Forum in New York City on a panel focused on scaling behind-the-meter solar and storage for commercial, industrial, and digital infrastructure. This is a critical topic as energy demand continues to grow, especially with AI and data centers. Also, make sure to check out the Solar Maverick Podcast new website at www.solarmaverickpodcast.com, where you can find all of our latest episodes and insight from leaders across the energy industry. Now let's get into it. Hi, this is Benoy Thanjan, your host of the Solar Maverick Podcast, and also the founder and CEO of Reneu Energy. Reneu Energy, we're a solar developer and consulting firm. We've developed more than 100 megawatts of solar projects across the U.S., and we help clients execute clean energy projects with confidence. We act as your owner's rep, overseeing developers, EPCs, and financing partners to de-risk your project and keep it on schedule. We also provide development as a service, supporting origination, strategy, and execution so you can advance projects without building a large internal team. On the renewable energy credit side, we offer REC brokerage, REC asset management, and custom renewable energy credit research, helping clients understand pricing, policy shifts, and long-term market dynamics. In addition, we provide new market analysis and financial modeling to evaluate opportunities, assess project viability, and support investment decisions. To learn more, reach out at info@reneuenergy.com. That's info@reneuenergy.com. We'll also have information on the notes of the podcast as well. Let's get into it.
It's commonly cited pumped hydro is 90% of the world's energy storage capacity on the grid, which is a figure I've tried to debunk because it's not true anymore. One of those things that's been cited, and it was true even not that long ago, like you go back 5 years, but the exponential growth of battery storage means that lithium-ion batteries are now 50% by power of all the world's stored energy on the grid. So it's actually 50-50 now.
Hello and welcome to the Solar Maverick Podcast, where solar meets entrepreneurship and experience. I'm your host, Benoy Thanjan, so let's get into it.
Hi, this is Benoy Thanjan, your host of the Solar Maverick Podcast. I'm really excited on this episode of the podcast to have Marek Kubik. He is a clean tech entrepreneur and energy storage expert. He was also in Forbes 30 Under 30 alum. He's an ex-founder of Fluence. He's been in the energy storage industry since 2009, and I have to thank Peter Pomgrantz from the Soulverse podcast for recommending me to speak to Marek. We had an amazing pre-call. Marek, welcome to the Solar Maverick Podcast. Thank you for making time today.
Absolutely no problem, Benoy. Thanks for inviting me, and I'm excited to be here with you.
Yeah, definitely. Obviously, everyone's talking about energy storage, and you've been talking about energy storage for a very long time. It's amazing for me to hear someone who's been now in the energy storage industry for 17 years. It must seem like eons or more than 17 years to see how much the industry has changed, and obviously the commercialization of technology is also seeing how much growth has happened within the energy storage space, both standalone and coupled with solar and other technologies. What made you believe so early that energy storage would become a cornerstone of the energy transition?
Yeah, great question. And it is strange, I would say. It's a bit of a weird time dilation thing because it doesn't feel anywhere near like that long ago. I remember it a little bit like it was yesterday, and it's just crazy kind of how much stuff happens every year in this industry. But in the very early days, just to rewind back to where I started, I had a background in renewable energy integration. I did a PhD in this sort of area, and I wasn't specifically looking at energy storage at the time. It just was happening to emerge as starting to become a solution to some of the challenges that power systems were having. And you could put that back right in the context of pre-renewables as well, because most people think of battery storage and energy storage in general as a renewable linked exercise and solution. But really, we were just looking at the time on how do we make energy grids more viable, more efficient using new technology that was emerging. And just at the time, really, that lithium-ion batteries were first starting to be used on the electric grid. The idea was essentially to take that technology and use it in the power grid instead. And if you look at the trajectory today, it's still the minority, like the mass majority of the batteries that are being produced today are in the EV segment, but stationary storage is growing very, very rapidly. And at some point it will overtake the EV applications. So, well, there was always the belief in the trajectory, because if you look at the technology, it's a material science technology. So the same people, I think, and the same viewpoint that people had on solar and how solar cost would come down, you could see the exact same trend mapping onto batteries, because it's just the technology you make in a factory, the material science gets better. The more research and effort you put into it, your yields go up, you have less waste, and it becomes more efficient. So the technologies have just got better and better and better. And we've started to hit an inflection point where you can really see it's a bit of a generalization, the 100% renewable grid, and we might get into that and unpack it a little bit more, but the direction of travel towards a very high renewable percentage, at least let's say, grid is highly feasible, cost effective already in large parts of the world, and it's getting to more and more places as those costs come down. So it's, I think, just a combination of being there really early and then seeing the trajectory that renewable technologies and then the energy storage technologies like batteries had in front of us at the time that made me quite excited to get involved in this sector and space and take some risks doing so.
Yeah, definitely. It's really exciting to hear about that. And I know you mentioned in the Solverse interview about a concept similar with chip computing is happening similar to batteries, where the more production of, like in this case, lithium ion batteries, it's
Mm-hmm.
also substantially decreasing the cost of the battery. And obviously, the technology is improving as well. Can you talk about that? I know, like, obviously, in chip computing, they use a concept called Moore's Law. For solar, I don't know if you've heard the term Swanson's Law. It's kind of similar, but I didn't even know there was a term for energy storage as well. I think you use that on that podcast as well. Can you talk about that whole concept and then how like storage helps intermittent power sources and regulating the grid? It would be great to get, your perspective on that.
Yeah, so in battery storage, the term is Wright's law. I think an analog or an equivalent to Moore's law, like you mentioned, or Swanson's law. So it's essentially there's differing views on exactly the improvement rate or the learning rate in the technology. But if you plot it logarithmically by sort of volume versus price, what you find is essentially a relatively linear relationship. The more you produce on a logarithmic scale, the more the costs come down. And it's somewhere around a 20 to 30% decline for every doubling of production, increase of production. So we've seen that play out time and time again. We're now in battery storage in the terawatt hours of production. So the volumes are getting larger and it's harder to keep scaling that more and more. But still, there's quite a lot of runway because in terms of, let's say, deployments, batteries are everywhere now, right? They're in phones, laptops, they're in cars, we have them homes, we have them in smart devices everywhere. But they're actually still, at least in the electricity grid context, a limited resource, right? They're not yet that bulk storage technology. And again, we might get into the multi-day and seasonal stuff later. They never really will be in that space. But in terms of really bulk day to night energy shifting, that wasn't feasible until the cost declines of the last 2 or 3 years where that started to get into the money. So this trend continues, and it's not just a cost trend, it's also a trend on density, it's a trend on performance, so the cycle life of the batteries. all of these elements, as they improve, are sort of compounding to make the product better and better at more and more applications and more use cases. So the more that improves, the more markets you unlock for battery technology to solve in the grid scale space. So coming back to the other part of your question, which was, what are the kind of things you can do with these batteries? In the very early days, the low-hanging fruit were things like ancillary services. So essentially things that you could do with fossil fuel power plants, but you can do better with a technology like a battery, which is not limited by any minimum generation level. You can switch it on from 0 to 100 in milliseconds. Let's say a coal plant might take hours to warm up and to get going and running. And even once it's running, to get a change in its response takes minutes as opposed to seconds. All right, so batteries being able to respond in milliseconds, have no minimum generation, being able to charge as well as discharge, meant that the very sort of rapid modulation of frequency that typically needed to be done by fossil fuel power plants in the past could be replaced cost effectively by batteries. So even when, like 15 plus years ago, batteries were over $2,000 a kilowatt hour, right? The cost was massively higher than it is today. But it still made sense to do some of these services because it would let your thermal power plant run more efficiently, higher output with lower emissions at a lower unit cost. So those are the typical very early low-hanging fruits, because we could only afford to build very short duration batteries of 15, 20 minutes at the time because of the cell costs being so high. But unless you want me to, I can go through, there's many, many different applications. But like if I go to the other end of the spectrum today, we're now starting to see 10, 11, 12-hour batteries in certain markets be economical and be built through different market structures, which is much more, because the costs have come down so much, about the bulk energy shifting, right? So that kind of use case, which pairs very well with solar in especially good solar markets, is very interesting. So you can take your solar profile from day to night, and you can do that now relatively cost effectively in especially the Middle East at a competitive cost point with essentially thermal generation or nuclear. And then there's a lot of different applications in between. There are a lot of things that you need to be able to replace as you have less and less thermal generation on the system. So some of the advanced capabilities, grid forming capabilities that battery energy storage systems have, providing virtual inertia, providing voltage ride through, all these types of things as well have also started to become more and more interesting as services, because we're starting to run into times where grids will run maybe not 100% of the year on renewables, but at least hours of the day or days of the year where the renewable percentage will be extremely high. And that becomes quite difficult to deal with the stability issues associated with it. I hope that's a good enough kind of overview. If you want me to go deeper on anything or any of the other use cases, happy to do so.
Yeah, that's really great, like high level Marek overview. Can you talk about, like, you mentioned a little bit like these other applications, maybe go into more detail about that if people are not familiar? I think you're doing a great job of like educating our audience, who we call Mavericks, about like energy storage, the technology, then like high level to like what are the use cases and, obviously, and how like it could basically power the grid of the future as well.
Yeah, so one of the other areas that I think is really interesting in it, it's really a whole bucket of different solutions. It's called non-wires alternatives, NWA, you might see it sometimes written as, and it essentially covers a whole bunch of different types of use cases to do with building power lines or not building power lines, as the case may be. It actually pairs really well, especially with the solar use case, right? Because if you imagine that same use case I was talking about earlier about just the energy shifting, you build more solar than you need in the day, and instead of curtailing it, you store it in the battery to use at night. That energy shifting is not just a temporal problem, it's also a geographic problem. So typically you have your renewable plants not where your demand is, and you have to get it from A to B. And if you have a power line between A and B, you can't just build more solar without building more power lines, right, on its own. But what's really very exciting to me, and especially the work I'm doing now in the Middle East, is the opportunity to combine both of these things together. Because if you have, let's say, integrated thinking between the transmission planning and the renewables, then instead of building a new power line to get more solar from here to here, which might be very difficult in most places, both in terms of cost, because it's millions of dollars per kilometer or mile for your US audience, or it's just a community opposition problem, right? That people don't want power lines near them. But if you put a battery at that solar site, it's not just solving the energy shifting problem day to night. It also means you may not need a larger power line, right? Because you can just get more power produced. And then during the times the solar is producing, you're exporting that solar. And when the solar has dropped off, the battery is going to pick that up. So you can massively increase actually your utilization of existing power infrastructure. It can go up from somewhere around 30-40% usage if you just had the solar power line and the demand, to near 100% by putting a solar long duration battery and then keeping the power line the same. It's not perfect, but it's a really useful solution to a lot of the congestion problems that you have with solar. And to an extent, you can do it with wind, although wind, it's a little bit more challenging just because the output of wind is more variable, more erratic compared to a solar profile where it's a little bit more predictable, the behavior. That's another, let's say, big bucket of use case, basically alternatives to building new transmission lines or increasing the utility of existing ones, or deferring investment, right? That it may not be that you can get away without building a power line at all, but maybe you can push it back 5 or 10 years. If you can do that, that also has a significant value just because of the time value of money, right? You can invest it in other things in the meantime.
Yeah, definitely. That's the key point, is really it's allowing necessary grid upgrades, right, to be delayed if you put, standalone or storage with some sort of energy resource that it helps with. I guess, like, we're talking about DERs or distributed energy resources, and how that's like will help maintain the grid longer. I know in the US we've seen, the grid's relatively old, and obviously the grid of the future will have to be smarter as well, right? Because it's not like you're getting power plant and then it's going through a transmission distribution network. Can you talk about, like, how the grid of the future is going to be very different than it is today? Obviously, it's slowly transitioning, and this energy transition, even though you've been now in energy storage 2009, hasn't really started fully yet to the scale, but it's going to happen very quickly. Can you talk about the grid of the future and how energy storage is going to be a vital part of that going forward?
Sure. It depends a little bit where and how far into the future. So paint me a bit more of a picture here, like which markets, are we talking global, are we talking anywhere specific, and how far into the future?
We could talk global, and then how about 20 years, 30 years in the future?
Okay. These sort of things, we may be revisiting this podcast in 20 years and seeing if I'm right. So I'm a little cautious about making predictions over that sort of length of time, because there are uncertainties about what technology breakthroughs we have, right? I think we're quite good as humans at planning linearly. And part of the challenge is a lot of these changes are exponential curves. So solar got exponentially better very quickly. And this is why you see exponential deployment. It's the same with batteries. We might see some similar breakthrough with something else. So I'm going to ignore the breakthrough parts for now,
definitely.
because
That's comfortable.
It's not so much about comfort. It's those sort of things can dramatically change the picture.
Sure.
If we're talking about, I mean, SMRs have been talked about forever and they're always quite far away. Fusion's always quite far away, but you could have those sort of things that might materially change the picture. If we focus at least on the technology trends that we can see today, there is a limit to how cheap solar can get, and there is a limit to how good a battery can get. You might have more breakthroughs in the technology beyond, I mean, even within lithium-ion, there have been different technology, let's say, or chemistries that have been used in grid storage over the last 15 plus years, just as we've kind of become a little bit more specialized as an industry in recognizing what characteristics are important in stationary grid storage as opposed to batteries in computers or in cars, right? There are different priorities across the various things you can trade off on. We will reach an ultimate floor, but ultimately that floor is a very low floor, right? The cost of solar power plus battery storage will be, I'm very confident, in at least good irradiance markets. So think the sunny parts of the world, southern US, the Middle East, North Africa, GCC region, India, so on. You will have very, very cost competitive, virtually round the clock power. Again, there will be maybe days or periods of time where you need to deal with multi-day lulls of output. So in somewhere like the Middle East, that could be sandstorms, In other geographies where maybe the system is more wind driven, it's a little bit more challenging. So in Northern Europe, you have a lot of wind power and you need really multi-day storage to solve that. But in the sunnier parts of the world, it's really primarily a day to night problem. And so you can get to sort of 90, 95, maybe even 99% power delivery, reliable power delivery over the long term with just sort of 8-10 hours of storage plus PV. And then it's a sort of sensitivity to how much do you overbuild the PV and the BESS to deal with multi-day issues versus doing something else. I'm a little bit more of a pragmatist in that I think if we build up our stack of what does a near 100% renewable power system look like, I think in these parts of the world, you'll see very much it's dominated by solar and long duration storage, and likely that's going to be battery-based electrochemical storage. We might get again into other technologies in this discussion, but you won't get that 100% reliability piece, and you still have to deal with something like sandstorms. So there's the resilience piece. That's the one I think is a little bit harder to predict, because if you were looking at this purely from an economic standpoint, what you would probably do is accept 90, 95, 99% clean power, and the last 1% can very reliably be served by fossil fuels still, right? You still have natural gas, which you'll be using much more sparingly, but peakers are really good at running and starting up quickly and filling in those gaps when they're needed. Potentially, if we have a solid breakthrough in the cost of e-fuels, you could see substitution to something like green hydrogen, but currently the cost of it is, let's say, if cost was the issue about minimizing the energy costs, you're likely to get to some decent percentage of solar plus storage and then just be using a little bit of fossil fuel. But if you want to be purist about no emissions, then I think e-fuels are most likely to be the way you would build that renewable system in these types of markets, which are solar dominated. It's not to say that you won't necessarily see long duration storage solutions emerge as well, but really most people compare them and try and contrast them to batteries. And to me, that's the wrong pairing, because really you're dealing with, if you're looking at multi-day storage sort of solutions, it's more competing with the incumbent fossil fuel, which will run less and less often like a gas plant. So what will it look like in 20, 30 years? It could look completely clean, but I think what we're likely to do in most markets is stop around that 95% level and realize that the last 5%, the amount you have to overbuild storage and solar to do it on a purist basis is very difficult. There doesn't seem to be an easy solution to slot in to deal with very long duration storage. And this is also a problem in the more Northern European markets where it's more wind driven. But you'll likely see a combination of all the above, right? You'll see a lot of solar, a lot of storage. You will see the wind because the wind is complementary with the solar. You will see hydro in the places you can build hydro. And we'll likely see a lot more interconnectedness, as well as the 3 Ds, which I'm sure your audience is familiar with, right? Decarbonized, decentralized, and digitized systems, right? They'll be more complex, more two-way, but largely lower cost, cleaner, and as reliable, if not more reliable than they were before, which is always something I've believed in strongly, but haven't always had agreement from, like, let's say the incumbent industry. You know, if you're building a lot of solar or other renewables on the grid, that you have more stability challenges. You can solve those, but it's through this pairing of technologies.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's really like a great explanation, Marek, grid of the future and how it could be like majority renewables, and then obviously having fossil fuels with the last part of it. It would be helpful actually if you explain like what the 3Ds are. You also briefly mentioned e-fuels as well. You know, we have a wide range of different listeners at different levels of the energy industry. So it'd be helpful if you could talk about, you know, those two things, because I think it's an important part of the discussion that you're talking about.
Yeah, sure. So the 3Ds, so again, they stand for decentralized, decarbonized, and digitized. So maybe each of them is self-explanatory, but decarbonized meaning essentially the renewable forms of energy, or those that don't produce carbon when they're generating power. You could, depending on your use of that definition, include technologies where there's carbon capture as well, right? So there's emissions produced, but they're captured and stored, and therefore it's carbon neutral. And you could include nuclear technology in that as well, right? Because it also doesn't produce carbon. So that's the decarbonized part. The decentralized part is essentially that the grid of the past consists typically of large centralized fossil fuel power plants. And increasingly, as you go to renewable forms of generation, which have just happened to start to be deployed more and more because they became cheaper and cheaper on a levelized cost of electricity basis, they are just the technology you would build if you want to build lowest electricity cost in most places around the world, where the wind capacity factor, which is essentially a measure of how windy it is, or the solar irradiance is good enough. So in those places, you're going to build those decarbonized resources anyway. But typically, each unit is smaller, right? So that's what we also mean by the decentralized aspect of it, right? You won't have necessarily, I mean, you can have multi-gigawatt scale generation parks of solar and wind, but you can also spread them out across multiple geographies. So this is the decentralized part. And the digitalized part is essentially referencing that there is a lot more data with these technologies, right? If you think of how many cells there are in a battery storage system, or how many PV panels in a solar park, there is a lot of data there to monitor and to optimize. And it's not one way anymore. It's not power flowing from dispatchable fossil fuel generation to the demand. It's two-way. You'll have even solar on rooftops of houses, on industries, business parks. So the power flows are more complicated. They're two ways. And there's a lot of data there to analyze and monitor. It could include as well things like the EV, where you plug them in, and whilst they're plugged in, they can interact with the grid as well and decide how to charge, how to discharge, when to do so. All of that is the digitalization component. So that's the 3Ds. And then your other question was the e-fuels. So e-fuels, essentially fuels that are synthesized from clean sources. So one, say, very popular example of that was talked about a lot in the last few years and went through a bit of a hype cycle is green hydrogen. So you can basically use electricity generated from wind and solar resources to synthesize. You have an electrolyzer that creates basically green hydrogen fuel from that. And when you've made it from those sources, there's no carbon that's gone into making the hydrogen. And when you burn the hydrogen, you can essentially extract the energy from it. And your byproduct is essentially water, so clean water. So very neat in principle. The problem is, from let's say a green perspective, to make green hydrogen is currently more expensive than to make gray or black hydrogen, which is being made essentially from fossil fuel processes. So you can do the same thing, but with carbon emissions essentially. So whilst you can get a dispatchable fuel made from zero carbon sources, it is more expensive than the fossil fuel equivalent. Or even instead of using instead of using gray or black hydrogen for generating power, you're just going to use the natural gas, because it has less losses along the way. And currently the hydrogen that we do produce is usually for more specialist industries. So that's one sort of, let's say, big example, but it could be biodiesel, it could be other fuel sources that you're synthesizing to run a thermal power plant on instead. That could be also completely clean. So again, it comes back to, is the priority, let's say, 100% net renewable system, even if that's going to cost more, or is it arriving at the most cost efficient solution? Because I was always a big advocate of, leading by costs, not by ideology of saying we have to be 100% renewable, but rather that somewhere very close to 100% renewable is going to actually be the most cost effective, because just this pairing of exponentially improving technologies like solar, batteries, wind is going to lead you in that direction. And the challenges that it produces are still solvable. And it's just a question of what you want to prioritize when you're solving them. I hope that's enough, like not too deep and not too shallow.
Yeah, that's a great summary of all those different concepts. Obviously, it's a lot of information. I think it's great that you're leading by costs, then obviously it being renewable energy. As we both know, solar and storage is a technology, not a fuel. And obviously the technology continues to get better. Obviously, the price is going lower. The efficiencies of, this technology is getting better. And it's the fastest as well to come online. You were talking about SMRs, that could take like 10 years, or, obviously fission and fusion, they're still really not an accepted like technology at this point. Obviously, I've heard about some, early stage sort of technologies that could be game changing, which I think there probably is technologies that are not, how can I say it the right way? Mainstream, I guess, is the right way of saying it, that could change, obviously, the energy future, as you mentioned before. So it's interesting. There's a lot of innovation that's happening.
The nuclear space is kind of an interesting one. And I think it's worth touching on because I'm in no way, let's say, a technology optimist and I'm an engineer, but I actually really think nuclear technology is very cool, but it has some just structural problems to it. SMRs potentially offer the solution to those problems. So SMR being small modular reactor, audience members who don't maybe know that, which the idea is that it's a bit more standardized to build because a nuclear power plant is so large and complicated to build that it often takes decades and has significant cost overruns very, very typically. So those particular problems, this is what I mean by structural. So firstly, as an investor, if you're going to invest in a technology, what you generally want to do is see a good return on investment, low risk, and fast payback. And you don't really have any of those things with nuclear. You have a very long construction period with quite high risk of overrun. If you look at different technologies and mean cost overruns, solar is at one end of the spectrum where the mean cost overrun is very low because it's modular, it's built in a factory, you literally plonk it on site and it's very simple to install. Whereas you have a lot of complexity with building a nuclear facility, which is why you have these cost and time overruns. The second is you've put that money in and you won't see the money out until it starts generating electricity. And typically, let's say 10 years is sometimes optimistic. We have projects, and I'm from the UK, and we have a nuclear power station that's been built Hinkley C for, I can't remember exactly how long now, but we're definitely over 10 years now, and it's still not producing. It still keeps getting pushed back and pushed up in terms of cost. So until it starts generating the electricity, you're not getting that return on investment. So you've locked away a lot of capital, and it's a very long time before you're getting the money out of it. Whereas when it comes to something like wind, solar, batteries, as you said, very quick to build. You can build these projects in a very modular fashion with quite low risk of cost overrun, and they'll be online in a year or 2 years. So you've only put your capital away for a year or 2 years before they'll start generating you revenue and a return on investment. So that structural problem makes it quite difficult for private sector money to build something like nuclear unless you have a big breakthrough in SMRs, which, like I said, has been talked about a lot, of standardizing and making it a bit more factory built where you can plonk it on site. The idea is good, but I've been hearing SMRs talked about pretty much for 20 years as well. So when I was doing my PhD, I was looking at this technology also, and it was also being promised as being, it's just a few years away. And that was back in 2009, and now we're in 2026 and it's still a few years away. So just to say, right, again, my objections are not ideological in any way. I think nuclear is a great technology. And if you have it running, it's very foolish to switch it off. Germany is, for example, did this with, let's say, ideological view that nuclear is bad. We should turn off the nuclear reactors that were already there, and has ended up creating for itself a massive exposure to Russian gas and oil as a result, because you needed something else to fill that gap. So it's quite different to maintaining an existing fleet versus, let's say, building a new one, because just the time impact, how long it will take you to build nuclear, even if you decide to do it today, is so long that the carbon impact of waiting 10 years versus building renewables now and in a year or two is very, very significant, considering how much, you can save on your electricity costs once this low cost renewable technology is online.
Yeah, definitely. That's a great explanation about SMRs, and the challenges related to that versus solar, wind, and batteries. And it's interesting because we talked about this, that lithium-ion dominates today, but the industry is exploring other technologies for battery storage, like sodium-ion, flow batteries, and other chemistries. What technologies do you think could meaningfully reshape the storage landscape?
Yeah, great question. It's one I take a lot of interest in, because partly there's two things you want to do, even with lithium-ion having become as, let's say, prevalent as it has in grid storage. Is one, you mitigate risk. So for instance, back in 2022, there was a big price spike in lithium carbonate, and that resulted in massively increasing prices for grid storage systems, which came up and then came down very rapidly. So there's mitigating that volatility and not being single source reliant, let's say. The second, which has become less of a problem than it was a few years ago when I started looking at this problem, was more around stratification of the technology. So it was very clear that lithium-ion was the best technology for 1 hour, 2 hours, 4 hours of storage. There was, if you go back a few years, quite a strong narrative that above 4 hours wouldn't be lithium-ion. And historically pumped hydropower, so hydroelectric power, but with some kind of storage reservoir where you can move the water up and down by basically using electricity to pump water back up the hill, was the sort of more dominant technology if you were looking at longer duration energy storage. And then you have other things like you mentioned, flow batteries, compressed. They have their different sweet spots in terms of duration of storage capacity and how you cycle them, right? So those are the two maybe axes on the spectrum of like how many cycles per day or per week or per year do you want to do, and what duration do you want to store. And you could map out these different technologies. And if you go back 10 years, maybe even 5 years, you would have seen something along the lines I've described, that the lowest levelized cost of storage, if you plot it out as a heat map, you would see lithium-ion batteries dominating about 1 to 2 cycles per day. So up to 365 times 2, so 760 cycles per year, and up to 4 hours. And then if you were going longer duration than that, or if you were looking at more cycles, you would have seen more flow batteries for very high cycling going this way. And going upwards, you would see pumped hydro be the dominant technology for, let's say, 8-10 hours storage. The reason I say that that second problem became a lot simpler for us is most of the use cases for long duration energy storage, which is defined as 8+ hours, are actually daily storage. You need a 8 or 10 hour battery, roughly, you can do the math, to shift solar from day to night, because broadly speaking, during the day, you've got the power from the solar, and it's only the nighttime period where you know it's going to be zero. So solving the 8 hour to 10 hour space was the most important one to solve. And that kind of solved itself because of this Wright's law topic I mentioned earlier, which is just simply that cell cost for lithium-ion batteries has come down so much compared to, just to give you an idea how rapidly it came down from that 2022 high to today, or to the end of last year, it became 300% cheaper. So you could buy 3 times more batteries today or in 2025 than you could in 2022. Now, it's a little bit of cherry pick because this spiked up and then came down, but that's a huge trajectory, right? So this is what I mean when I said 3 years ago, there wasn't really a solution to this problem. And so we were looking at a lot more technologies, but now it's very, very difficult to see anything displace lithium-ion in that 8 to 10 hour space, unless there is some kind of fundamental price shock like there has been in the past. So this is the first topic I mentioned, volatile spike. That seems to me quite unlikely, and we can get into the reasons why. But there are still some technologies that are quite interesting as a drop-in replacement or alternative. So this is sodium-ion, which you mentioned is a really interesting one in this case, because sodium-ion battery is very, very similar to a lithium-ion battery. If you look at the cell from the outside, it looks the same. It's the same sort of prismatic form factor. Still has a cathode, still has an anode, still has an electrolyte. The difference is on the anode side, the anode is a hard carbon instead of synthetic graphite. And that's interesting for a number of reasons, because you can make hard carbon, maybe hesitate to say more easily. You can basically get it from any carbon-based source. You can burn biomass to get it, olive pits. You can make it from petroleum byproducts. So it's geographically, let's say, ambiguous. You could get it from anywhere. And the same is true on the cathode side. So instead of using lithium carbonate, and lithium's, let's say, it's a critical mineral, but it's not a rare earth, as is often thought, right? Lithium is not limited in availability. It's very abundant. It's periodic element number 3. It just exists in low concentrations and it's hard to extract quickly. So the biggest risk to the pricing of something like lithium-ion as we keep scaling up and building more and more is that you just can't scale up production quickly enough to meet the demand, and that leads to a price spike. So sodium-ion is made from salt, basically. So sodium chloride, you can get it from soda ash. The US has one of the biggest soda ash mines in the world. So again, in terms of supply chain availability, both these raw materials for sodium-ion batteries are global and abundant. And the floor price is really, really cheap, right? If you think of the bill of materials, put aside the production cost, but you just look at the cost of these ingredients, so to speak, the floor price is theoretically lower. So you can get sodium-ion batteries that in the future, if they scale up and follow the same cost trajectory that we've seen with lithium, that are cheaper than lithium-ion batteries. So to me, that's why sodium-ion is a very interesting technology, either as something that in the long run may be able to beat lithium-ion out on price, potentially, but definitely at least provides a hedge. So to the point I mentioned the first, which is if lithium prices spike, they can't spike very much anymore before you'll start switching. Because before, back when this happened in 2022, there wasn't really an alternative. This big burst of research and focus in sodium-ion batteries came because of the price spike and because everyone started looking at what do we do? How do we mitigate? So you saw a huge spike in interest in sodium-ion back then. And that didn't really go away. It's not been competitive versus the lithium ion until today. But now we're getting to a point where the technology is starting to catch up. It's still not there. The cell is still more expensive today at a cell level than the lithium ion. And depending on your particular flavor of sodium ion, because there are different types of sodium ion, just as there are different types of lithium ion, like NMC and LFP, you have different types of sodium ion chemistries as well. But generally speaking, the disadvantage of the sodium is the density. It's lower energy density per volume and per weight. So sodium ion, I'm quite bullish on that it could be a very interesting technology to watch for the future. I'm happy to take any follow-ups on that, but I realize I've spoken for quite a while there, so I don't know if you want me to move to other technologies or if you want to dive a bit deeper on the sodium ion first.
Maybe if you could talk about the other technologies first and then go back.
Sure. So coming back to my two axes that I talked about, right? The duration and then the cycling. So I mentioned that if you go back a few years, there was the space that lithium ion was dominating up to 4 hours, up to 2 cycles a day. And above that, you saw the pumped hydro being as the mature technology really that's very widely deployed. It's commonly cited, by the way, pumped hydro is 90% of the world's energy storage capacity on the grid, which is a figure I've tried to debunk because it's not true anymore. One of those things that's been cited, and it was true even not that long ago, like you go back 5 years, but the exponential growth of battery storage means that lithium-ion batteries are now 50% by power of all the world's stored energy on the grid. So it's actually 50-50 now with pumped hydro. It was overtaken last year. On energy, it's still hydro's ahead, but it's again going to be overtaken within the next 4 or 5 years. So putting that aside, that was kind of the space that was above. But as the lithium ion costs have fallen, they've pushed more and more upwards. So now it used to be above 4 hours. Now it's kind of above 10, 11, 12 hours, this boundary. And so pumped hydro has been pushed out that way. It's still a great technology if you have the geography for it, right? Pumped hydro is very good if you need multi-day storage resilience. So, okay, other technologies, like remembering these two axes again, you've got duration on one axis, and the use cases that you have for different, let's say, storage applications will vary by duration. What's commonly referred to as long duration energy storage by Department of Energy definition is anything 8 hours plus. And as you start getting into this longer duration space on this axis, a few years ago, even like before this, significant decline we've seen in the last few years in lithium ion, the dominant technology in that space was hydro storage. And it's still a very mature technology class deployed all over the world. It's commonly cited as being over 90% of storage capacity, and this is something that's out of date. It's now actually on an energy basis being very quickly caught up by lithium ion, and on a power basis, it's already been overtaken by lithium ion. And so pumped hydro is sort of the technology you start to see become levelized cost of storage competitive, when today now it's somewhere around the 8, 10, maybe even 12-hour mark. When you get to about 8 to 10 hours, it's a clearer sort of tipping point for pumped hydro. But of course, for pumped hydro, you need the geology to be able to cost effectively build it, and it takes quite a long time to build. So the other issue is by the time you've built something like a pumped hydro project, which is mature, basically primarily concrete infrastructure, right? There's some cost with the turbines, but it's mostly a big civil infrastructure project. This type of thing, to get planning, to get the construction done, build a dam, build a reservoir, the pumps up and down, right? The culverts, the channels built through the mountains, is a slow process. So even in that longer duration space, we're starting to see other technologies come in, and compressed air, so mechanical forms of storage, compressed air, liquid, basically moving blocks, so you can describe it as essentially gravity-based storage one way or another, is becoming quite cost effective as well, because it's a little bit more, let's say, factory-based. You can manufacture more of the components in a standardized way. So when you get to about this 12, 14 hour space, you're starting to see those technologies be the most cost-effective form of storage as you look at levelized cost of storage. Then on the other axis, so this is about duration, and you can get into 10, let's say, these double-digit long duration storage, and then you can get into hundreds of hours, of thousands of hours. As you get further up on that axis, it becomes very, very difficult to store, let's say, competitively, because by definition, your cycling becomes extremely low, right? Because the other axis is number of cycles you can do. If you have a 24-hour battery, you can't cycle more than half a cycle a day, right? Because it takes you 24 hours to discharge, and then it takes you at least 24 hours to recharge, if not longer, because the efficiency isn't going to be perfect. So really, actually up in the top space, when you get beyond something like compressed air, there are the technologies out there like the iron air batteries, for instance, that are in the 100-hour space. There are different technologies that have these sweet spots, but really they're starting to compete against the fossil fuel use case, right? Because when you're basically looking at really seasonal shifting or filling in the gaps for periods of time, your default solution would be to use peaking generation. So that's where I find really important to convey, because most people will do a comparison against batteries and say, okay, we need energy storage, batteries can do one job. When you get into this longer duration space, there are for sure technologies that will be better at it than lithium-ion batteries or even sodium-ion batteries, but they have to compete use case by use case in different markets against the incumbent technology, right? Which could be fossil fuel based, right? If you're looking at cost and not a purist zero carbon one. Then going the other way, in very, very high cycle applications, it used to be that you saw flow batteries sit in this space. So flow batteries' big advantage over lithium-ion battery is very low degradation, essentially negligible degradation. So the more you cycle, that more that advantage becomes apparent. But it has really just struggled CapEx-wise. It doesn't compete on CapEx. So even if you can get a flow battery that can cycle very, very high times, if it's going to be multiples more expensive upfront to buy, that degradation advantage just isn't enough to offset the physical cost of the system. And it's a little bit also contradictory, even because flow batteries, one of the arguments is that they're better at longer duration. But as I said, really then it's pumped hydro, compressed air, these types of tech that you're competing with in that space. And so when you go into the longer duration, it's not really so much the lithium-ion batteries either. But when you get into high cycling, it's just for high cycle use cases, the duration of the battery has to be lower, right? Because you can't cycle a long duration battery anywhere near as much. So that sort of is kind of the landscape. I would see flow batteries really have been kind of squeezed out of the market. The only place where you have very, very high cycling, short duration applications is maybe something like flywheels. So flywheels are a technology that basically can't store for very long, but they can provide, a lot of cycling with very little wear and tear. So the landscape is quite complicated. Like lithium has really ballooned out up into the longer durations and into the more cycles, the better batteries have got. But there are still places and there are still applications that other technologies have an advantage in or a sweet spot in.
Yeah, definitely. I really appreciate the detailed explanation of the different technologies, Marek. And this has been a great podcast interview. Is there any other industry trends that our audience, who we call Mavericks, should know about with regards to energy storage?
Oh, there's quite a few. I mean, in terms of energy storage, if you're interested in the tech itself, a few of the trends to watch for, there's increasing specialization. So the batteries used in stationary storage really were driven by EVs, right? It's the same EV cells and you would just put them in stationary storage. But the specialization that's going on is becoming quite interesting, because if you really optimize for stationary storage use cases, as opposed to those driven by electric vehicles, which are essentially driven by range, speed of recharging, the chassis size of the car, you can get more and more optimal designs. So we're starting to see clever and clever, let's say, designs of the storage systems, and these larger format cells that last, well, they have disadvantages for higher cycling, so high power use cases. But as we're looking at moving into these 6, 8, 10-hour spaces, really towards the renewable system, these larger format cells potentially bring a lot of cost benefits and density benefits to the system. So there's a lot going on in that space and increasing specialization. So I think that's probably one of the big ones to watch. You'll also see, if you're building storage alongside solar projects, there's these increasingly modularized factory built products that are starting to get quite clever, because we're hitting into weight and, let's say, dimension limitations on what you can easily manufacture in a factory and ship. But a lot of manufacturers and suppliers are getting quite clever at modularizing the products and making them, either stackable or assembled on site into a larger product, but with quite sort of, let's say, ready building blocks that come out of a factory. So I think those are some of the interesting trends in energy storage that we didn't really talk about much yet.
Yeah, definitely. And is there anything else that our audience should know about energy storage that we haven't spoken about that you think, it's been amazing because of like the breadth of information that you've covered in a very short time and then keeping things very high level. But is there anything that we haven't spoken about that you think?
I think I could keep finding stuff the longer that we go. So if you keep asking me this question, I'll keep finding new ones.
I'll just ask it in different ways.
I'll give you one more that I think is quite interesting. So we talked about sodium-ion batteries earlier, but we didn't really get into the application and why are they really interesting? Because we talked about cost competitiveness and, that they're basically a drop-in replacement. One of the things I think is really interesting to see if it will happen, we're starting to see it in a few cases, is passive energy storage system designs, because sodium-ion batteries have a much wider temperature range they can operate in, very cold, very hot, and they don't have a drop off in their performance like lithium-ion. So lithium-ion battery, you need to keep it about 25 degrees to keep this degradation curve that most suppliers will offer. So you have a cooling system or a heating system to do that. If you have a system that can really withstand very hot climates, like in the desert, or very cold climates without needing these heating cooling systems, you have a much simpler system, right? Because you don't have all these mechanical components that can fail and that you need to maintain. So that's going to be also kind of a really interesting trend. We might see, let's say, a move towards very simple product design, like very passive. It's just a block that sits on the side. And all of the cleverness is going to be in how you use it, how you dispatch it, these sort of grid forming applications we talked about. So that's another one that I think is kind of interesting that we didn't really touch on.
Yeah, definitely. That's great. And I know you have a lot of experience in the Middle East and in energy storage. Obviously, right now, there's a lot of uncertainty with what's happening in Iran, with Israel and the US. How do you think that's going to impact like the energy storage market going forward?
Well, there's lots of different ways you could look at it. Let's say my best soundbite for this would be, and it's not I can't remember where it comes from, but I've seen someone say it before, is that you don't need to ship solar panels and batteries through the Strait of Hormuz. Fuel-based technologies, times like this, where there is a shock to, let's say, the global fossil fuel supply chain, can be really good catalysts for the energy transition, because it suddenly underscores the point very clearly that, if I have an electric car as opposed to an ICE car, I'm not exposed in the same direct way to oil prices going through the roof, and that no one can blockade the sun or the wind, essentially, right? So that side of it can be quite positive. On the other hand, today we do have a fossil fuel powered world, and for instance, the impact on that, like China is a big importer from the Middle East of these fuels to make everything that it makes for the rest of the world relatively cheaply. So those things are going to get more expensive, and that means battery projects are probably, if this continues, going to get more expensive in an indirect sense as a result of that, as well as some of the other policy stuff that's going on. I'm kind of more of the techno optimist about these things. I think even if that happens, the volatility and the opportunities on the monetization side of the technology also increases. So the two kind of, they're going to balance out. It's not either as simple as it's a good thing or a bad thing, quote unquote, for the clean tech sector.
Yeah, definitely. I appreciate you explaining, and it's great to get your perspective. This has been an amazing interview, Marek. If our audience wanted to learn more about you, what's the best way that they could do that?
The easiest way, and the thing that most people I'd say would know me for, is my LinkedIn page, LinkedIn profile. So I have a fairly unusual name. I'm the only Marek Kubik in energy storage. So you can easily find me by Googling me. I don't know if you have show notes, but you can put that there. I mean, I'd say that's the most straightforward way. Otherwise, I'm very frequently speaking at, industry events and things. So always happy to catch people at those whenever I'm attending them. I'll keep it as simple as that. That's probably the best way to find me or connect with me.
Yeah, definitely. I really appreciate your time, Marek. And it was really educational. I mean, like how much information you provided on what's the latest with energy storage, and at a very high level, which is not easy to do. So I appreciate you again making time, Marek, to be on the Solar Maverick podcast.
Thanks a lot for the invitation, and I'm glad Peter connected us to do this one. So yeah, hope it's useful and interesting for your audience. I know we've covered a lot of ground, so it might even take a couple of listens to unpack it all.
Yeah, definitely. I know I was listening to the first part of the interview. So, and then, definitely thank you to Peter from Solverse. He mentioned you were his favorite guest. So
I'm put in a difficult situation now because I can't say he's my favorite host because now I'm also speaking to you, right? So
I was going to see how you responded to it, actually. That's a great answer. Well, thank you again, Marek.
No problem.
Thanks for listening to the Solar Maverick Podcast. The Solar Maverick Podcast is brought to you by Reneu Energy. We're a solar development and consulting firm. If you believe that this podcast is adding value to you, please give us a 5-star review and share with those that you think could benefit from this information. Please email all questions, suggestions, and feedback to info@reneuenergy.com. That's info@reneuenergy.com. The Solar Maverick Podcast is produced by Podcast Laundry and executive produced by Benoy Thanjan and Kevin Y. Brown.